The studio lights blazed, illuminating one of America's most watched talk shows. The air crackled with anticipation as J.D. Vance, newly inaugurated as vice president, stepped onto the set. He was calm, composed, exuding the confidence of a man, with nothing to hide and everything to prove. Across from him sat Marcus Bennett, the show's host. A seasoned journalist, sharp-tongued and meticulously prepared, Bennett had been waiting for this moment. He had fine-tuned his questions, rehearsed his strategy. He wasn't here for an easy conversation. He was here to corner Vance, to make him stumble. Vance could tell. The usual pre-interview pleasantries felt rushed, mechanical. Bennett's smile never quite reached his eyes. The production team was unusually tense. Vance had faced pressure before, in the Marines, in politics. He recognized an ambush when he saw one. Bennett leaned forward, gripping his cue cards tightly. The first question came wrapped in politeness, but the intent was clear. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett began, his voice smooth, almost too casual, "let's talk about your remarkable journey, from Trump critic to his second-in-command." The audience tensed. They had heard this question before. Vance didn't flinch. He met Bennett's gaze with a measured smile. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a perfect place to start," he said, his tone even, "because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." A subtle ripple moved through the room. This wasn't the defensive answer Bennett had expected. Bennett's grip on his cards tightened. "Growth and understanding," he echoed, his tone edged with skepticism. "Is that what we're calling it now? Some might argue it's just political convenience." Vance tilted his head slightly, unfazed. "You see, Marcus, in America, we cherish the tradition of changing our minds when presented with new information," he said. "When I criticized the president years ago, I was looking at things through a narrow lens. But then I saw something remarkable. I saw his policies helping the very people I wrote about in my book, the people Washington had forgotten." For a fraction of a second, Bennett's expression tightened. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Vance caught it. Leaning in slightly, his voice steady, he asked, "Tell me, Marcus, have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the evidence and realized your first judgment might have been wrong?" The pause lingered a little too long. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President," Bennett finally said, just a little too quickly, a little too sharply. He shuffled his cards, searching for his next attack. He found it. "Speaking of changes," Bennett continued, his voice regaining its edge, "let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The energy in the room shifted. Bennett knew exactly what he was doing. He had stepped onto sacred ground, but the spark in Vance's eyes told him he had just walked into the wrong fight. Vance leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Divine guidance, Marcus," he repeated. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral leadership. They weren't afraid of faith, they were afraid of tyranny." A ripple moved through the audience. Bennett's jaw tightened. "But surely in our modern diverse society," Vance raised a hand, cutting him off, not aggressively but with quiet authority. "Let me finish this thought because it's important." His voice remained steady, unwavering. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, just as leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not just from government." Silence. Bennett glanced toward his producer as if searching for a lifeline. Vance didn't stop. His voice carried a note of personal reflection. "You know what's interesting, Marcus? When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody objected when we prayed before missions. Because in those moments when life and death were real, when the stakes were high, even the skeptics understood there was something deeper than politics." Bennett's face flushed. He was losing control. "Let's move on," he said abruptly, forcing the conversation forward. Your relationship with President Trump. But the shift had already happened. The audience felt it. The crew felt it. And Bennett knew. He had walked into his own trap. At the start of the interview, Bennett had believed he was in control. Now he was just trying to keep up. Vance didn't flinch. Extreme, he repeated calmly, his demeanor unshaken. You know what I think is extreme, Marcus? That some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families. He let the words settle over the silent studio. But since you brought up President Trump, Vance continued, his tone unwavering, let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's discuss what's actually happening in our communities since the inauguration. The studio fell into an unusual quiet. Even Bennett, known for his rapid-fire interruptions, found himself momentarily subdued. Vance's steady presence and measured responses weren't the easy targets he had expected. Bennett regrouped, leaning forward. Let's talk about your background, Mr. Vice President. You've written about your humble beginnings, yet here, you sit in the halls of power. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from. Vance met his gaze without hesitation. That's interesting, Marcus, he replied evenly. Because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit into the Washington elite's expectations. Bennett scoffed. Character? Is that what you call this complete reversal on Trump? You once wrote quite passionately against him. Yes, I did, Vance said without hesitation. And you know what takes real character? Admitting when you were wrong. Standing up for what you believe in even when people like you twist it into something else. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. Bennett tugged at his collar, frustration creeping into his voice. Mr. Vice President, you've built your reputation as a voice for working-class Americans. Yet here you are, in an expensive suit, defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The temperature in the room seemed to shift. A few audience members stirred uncomfortably. Vance, however, remained unfazed. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. You know what I see, Marcus? He said, his tone almost amused. I see someone who thinks an expensive suit changes a man's values. Let me tell you something. The values I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio don't change with your zip code or your job title. Bennett's eyes narrowed. So, you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition? That we should ignore your past criticisms? That we should just accept you as President Trump's? He paused, letting the word linger like a loaded weapon. Puppet. The word landed with a sharp edge. A few gasps scattered through the audience. Vance didn't blink. His response came with the precision of a master chess player. You know, Marcus, that word, puppet, says more about you than it does about me. His voice was measured, but beneath the surface was an unmistakable steel. In your world, strong loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. He leaned forward slightly, holding Bennett's gaze. In combat, you judge a person's character by their actions, not by what the media says about them. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues have created. The audience erupted into applause. Bennett tried to interject, but Vance pressed on. You call it being a puppet. I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump. Bennett's voice dripped with sarcasm. A man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once so vehemently opposed. There you go again, Marcus, Vance replied coolly. So focused on finding contradictions that you're missing the bigger picture. The real contradiction would be ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes, just to appease critics like yourself. Thunderous applause followed. Bennett glanced at his producer, who was gesturing frantically from the sidelines. Vance wasn't done. And since you brought up my intellectual background, he added with a smirk, let me remind you, true wisdom isn't measured by how many contradictions you can point out. It's measured by the strength to learn and grow. The tension in the room was palpable. Bennett, clearly rattled, fired back. Why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty in your administration's policies? Vance met the attack, head on. Oh, you want to talk about intellectual dishonesty, Marcus? His smirk faded, replaced by something sharper. Then let's discuss the way your network devoted an entire segment last week to questioning my faith, suggesting it was. Bennett's face tightened. I was merely pointing out the timing. The timing of what exactly? Vance cut in smoothly. The fact that I've attended the same church since before I entered politics. Or perhaps you'd like to question my grandmother's faith too, the woman who taught me to pray before every meal even when we barely had enough to share. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously. Let me be clear, Marcus, Vance continued, his voice strong and steady. My faith, my values, my convictions, they aren't political props, and no amount of media spin is going to change that. Silence. For the first time in the interview, Bennett had nothing to say. You can question my politics. You can disagree with my decisions, Vance said steadily. But when you suggest that my faith is nothing more than a political prop, you're not just attacking me. You're attacking every American who holds their faith dear. Bennett glanced at his notes, clearly searching for safer ground. Let's talk about your recent statements, he insisted. Yes, let's talk about statements, Vance agreed smoothly. Like your remark last month that anyone who supports traditional values is, he paused, then quoted, living in the past. Vance tilted his head slightly. Tell me, Marcus, do you really believe that? Do you think the millions of Americans who go to church every Sunday, who believe in family values, who love their country, are they all just living in the past? A defining silence settled over the studio. Bennett's carefully curated persona began to crack as he fumbled with his papers. Mr. Vice President, you're trying to turn this interview around. No, Marcus, Vance said, his voice unwavering. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the contempt you and your colleagues have for regular Americans. You invited me here thinking you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, my support for the president. He leaned in slightly. But let's talk about what really bothers you. The studio grew even quieter. Every eye was fixed on Vance. It bothers you, he continued, that someone like me, someone from where I come from, doesn't subscribe to your worldview. It bothers you that I went to Yale Law School and still hold traditional values, and most of all it bothers you that I see right through the game you're playing. Bennett tried to regain control. Your accusations, they're not accusations, Marcus. They're observations. For the first time, Vance's expression hardened. Like how you rolled your eyes earlier when I mentioned prayer, or how you mockingly referred to my hometown as Trump country on your show last week. His rebuke hit like a thunderclap, leaving the audience in stunned silence. This isn't about politics, Vance continued, his voice firm yet controlled. It's about respect. Respect for faith, respect for traditional values, respect for the millions of Americans who don't need your approval to love their country or support their president. Bennett's face paled. He glanced toward his producer, who now watched the exchange with a mix of concern and fascination. This interview had strayed far from Bennett's carefully planned ambush. Perhaps we should move on, Bennett muttered, checking his watch. Vance's eyes flicked to the movement and a slight smile touched his lips. I've noticed you've been doing that ever since we started talking about faith and values, he observed. Uncomfortable territory for you, Marcus? A few chuckles rose from the audience. For someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism, Vance continued, you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way. Bennett seized the moment for a counterattack. Is this the same kind of deflection you used when you switched from criticizing Trump to praising him? There you go again, Marcus, Vance replied, his tone cool and unshaken. You keep coming back to that, don't you? He leaned in slightly. Let me ask you something. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after getting to know them? After seeing their true character instead of relying on media narratives? From the audience, an elderly woman called out, Tell him, Mr. Vice President. Vance turned back to Bennett, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. You know what the real story is here, Marcus? It's not about my past criticisms or my current position. He let the words hang for a moment. It's about something that terrifies you and your colleagues. Bennett swallowed, waiting. It's about the fact that someone can think for themselves, that they can change their mind based on direct experience, that they can stand firm in their beliefs despite relentless. Bennett wiped at his brow, visibly sweating. Mr. Vice President, you're twisting my words. No, Marcus, Vance replied, his voice calm but unrelenting. I'm just holding up a mirror, and I don't think you like what you see. A journalist who came here hoping to embarrass me, only to expose his own prejudices. He turned to the audience, addressing them directly. You see, what Marcus doesn't understand is that true integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you were wrong, even when people like him are waiting to pounce. Thunderous applause erupted from the crowd, even some of the production crew nodding in agreement. A universal signal to wrap it up flashed from the producer's booth, but it was too late. The momentum in the room had shifted beyond Bennett's control. And you know what else, Marcus? Vance continued, his voice steady but firm. The American people are tired. Tired of being looked down on for their faith. Tired of being mocked for their values, and most of all, tired of journalists who think their job is to tell people what to think instead of reporting the truth. The studio exploded. The entire audience was on its feet, their applause drowning out any attempt by Bennett to regain control. His carefully orchestrated ambush had backfired spectacularly. Bennett cleared his throat, visibly shaken. His once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something almost resembling defeat. Well, I think we're about out of time, he muttered. Yes, I believe we are. Vance agreed, rising from his chair. But before leaving, he turned to face the camera directly, his expression resolute. But before I go, I have one last message for the American people watching at home. He took a breath, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. What you've seen today isn't just about one interview or one journalist's attempt to discredit me. It's about something far bigger. It's about standing firm in your convictions. They thought they could shame me for my faith. They thought they could mock my support for President Trump. They thought they could force me to apologize for believing in traditional values. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't just political positions. These are the principles that built America, the values that carry us through hard times, the truths that will guide us forward. Vance straightened his tie, standing tall. To every American who has ever been ridiculed for their faith, mocked for their values, or told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe. With that, he turned and walked off the set. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just applause, it was a statement. A roar of approval that shook the studio. Bennett sat in stunned silence, his planned ambush dismantled, not by aggression, but by unwavering principle and quiet strength. And in that moment, one truth became undeniable. Sometimes, the best response to arrogance is dignity, and the strongest answer to bias is truth. As Vance stepped off the set, the energy in the studio lingered, electric and undeniable. The applause continued long after he disappeared behind the stage curtain, leaving Bennett alone beneath the glaring lights. For a moment, Bennett simply sat there, his fingers tightening around his stack of notes that now felt useless, irrelevant. Behind the scenes in the control room, the network executives huddled together, their voices hushed but frantic. What the hell just happened? One producer hissed, pulling at his tie. He flipped the whole interview on its head. Another muttered. Bennett was supposed to expose him, not get exposed himself. The lead executive finished grimly. A tense silence settled over the group. This clip is going to go viral, isn't it? No one answered. They all knew the truth. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of how fast. Within minutes, clips of the interview flooded social media. Vance shuts down host in viral debate. Bennett's ambush backfires spectacularly. Vice President drops truth bomb live on air. The footage spread like wildfire. The network's attempt to corner Vance had only given him a national platform, one they couldn't control. As Vance stepped into his waiting car, his phone buzzed. A message from an old friend. You won the moment. Now win the war. Vance exhaled, staring out the window as the city blurred past. The battle was just beginning, and he was ready.